It's great to be here once again. My love affair with Newfoundland continues, and today I brought the good weather back once again. It was beautiful, and I'm actually contemplating getting a month here in January. I like the place so much, and everybody who lives here in January knows exactly what that means. I like it that much. If you'll indulge me a little further with, I guess, an ideas anecdote, and this is one that in some senses takes to task something Harry said last night about interactional expertise. I'll speak a little bit about what I would call something like interactional expertise, and I understand the differences, and I understand how in some senses shallow what I'm about to say may seem, but I've made friends over the past 8 or 9 years, and I mean friends, with Neil Turok, who is one of the world's most amazing physicists. He was born in South Africa, educated at Cambridge, best friends with Stephen Hawking, founded the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Ontario, which is home to some of the most amazing physicists in the universe. And they are doing really astounding work. Neil's become a friend of mine. We, of course, met when he delivered the Massey lectures on CBC Radio and traveled coast to coast. In fact, I believe the first Massey lecture that Neil Turok delivered of the 5 in the series was delivered right here in St. John's some years ago. And Neil and I have maintained a friendship. Back then, he would, of course, try to explain quantum physics to me after the lecture over fairly good whiskey. And I would usually say, I don't really understand what you're talking about at all unless I think about it poetically. And Neil would say, that's exactly how you should think about it. And there could come a time after the discussion had gone on for an hour or so, and probably 5 or 6 more whiskeys had been added to the table, I began to think I actually understood what he was talking about. And then, I mean, it comes along earlier this year. The Perimeter Institute put together a collaboration of physicists, and these are theoretical physicists. These are people, one of the people I interviewed this spring is the acknowledged world expert on the 17th nanosecond after the Big Bang. And in fact, not just that nanosecond, something like 1/100th of that nanosecond, he knows exactly what happened. And I interviewed him, and I had to say, I'm scratching my head and saying, I can't understand what you're talking about unless I think about it poetically. And Neil put together a conference, therefore, on the connections between imagination and physics, between poetry and physics, and Ideas was sort of a part of that celebration. In fact, we made 2 Ideas programs out of that 3-day conference held in Waterloo, Ontario at the Perimeter Institute only this spring. I'll move backwards, though, to the beginning of our friendship. And I said, you know, we would get drunk talking about strange things that I couldn't understand late at night after he delivered his Massey lecture. But we also talked about something else that was, I think, perhaps more germane to the topic at hand here right now, and that is knowledge and democracy. I don't know how many of you know, but I actually spent a good part of my own university career in Scotland. I was an exchange scholar at the University of St. Andrews, and then I ultimately earned my master's, my M.Lit, from the University of Edinburgh. And so I know a little bit about Scotland. And actually my thesis, which I hope, and I know nobody will ever read, nobody in this room will ever read my master's thesis, because of ancient rules at the University of Edinburgh, which was once a huge bastion of medical science. And so theses were actually considered private knowledge, something that nobody should share because somebody could make money out of it or do something with it beyond the bounds of medicine. There's a strange clause on the document you sign when you put your thesis in the university library, and that is that you can say that nobody will ever be allowed to read this thesis unless the author of the thesis and his supervisor or her supervisor also gives permission for that to happen. I won't give permission because I don't want anyone to read the thesis. My supervisor is dead, so I know that that book will sit on a dusty shelf in Edinburgh for a long, long time. The thesis was on the Scots in Canada, and that's an interesting topic. And I learned a great deal about what was then described as the Scottish character while I was studying for that thesis, while I was an historian. And in fact, I spent a great deal of time reading about the Scottish Enlightenment, and that was basically something that happened in Edinburgh, a place, I would say, not unlike St. John's. The weather's not always great. At that point, it was a poor place, a poor city in Scotland. Scotland was a poor country compared to England. But Scottish values were somewhat different from English values. Scottish people believed in the universality of education. They trusted that knowledge was an important tool that would not level society, but in some ways create equal opportunities. And the Scottish Enlightenment produced an astounding group of intellectuals, people who functioned in philosophy and in science, in architecture, in the fine arts. Edinburgh itself was a model city built, there was a slum and a swamp that had to be drained, and they created a European Enlightenment city. It was the first designed town in the entire universe. And I and Neil also talked about that. Neil and me talked about Scotland, talked about the Scottish Enlightenment. And Neil said, and it was strange because this was indeed what I had hoped to say in the thesis, that there's a lot in common between Canada and Scotland. Not only was Canada formed by Scots, the Scottish input into this country was over-important, in fact, over-represented. It had much more importance, much more influence than it should have had. But that created a country that had similar sorts of ideals to Scotland. Yeah, we're a poor country, a small country sitting on top of a giant that is much more powerful. But we have dreams and ideals that have more to do with education initially, more to do with making everybody have that kind of possibility to use their minds, to use their imagination, to make society a better place. And there is that kind of democratization, I think, in Canada and in Scotland. So I bring together those two themes, once again, knowledge and democracy. What was happening there is something that Neil said he wants to do at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Ontario. He wants to bring together the best minds in the world into a small place to imagine the kind of future that we could all have. And so this is the kind of, I guess, interactive expertise that I think is somewhat important. I could help Neil put together a conference with theoretical physicists who say things that I have no idea what they're talking about, except that I can just throw out that McLuhan-esque almost teaser and say, you know what, it's about imagination. It's about poetry. And that's the way that a humanist, not a social scientist and certainly not a scientist, I'm a humanist. That's how a humanist can participate in this dialogue between knowledge and democracy. And I guess that's why, other than the fact that the weather is great in Edinburgh, I was about to say, the weather is great in St. John's today. It's one of the real reasons that I'm happy and proud to be here as part of this, this symposium. I will briefly, very briefly, introduce Sheila Jasanoff right now. She is a professor. In fact, she is the Fordsheimer Professor of Science and Technology Studies at the Kennedy Center in Harvard. I believe she was the founder of that center and continues to lead the center, so she has a position of great importance. If we're talking about, and this is something that in Canada we used to talk about, that centers of excellence, that we could fund certain places that would perhaps focus on various parts of study, and perhaps by bringing together this critical mass of intelligence, we might actually make progress in some ways. Canada used to believe in that. I believe the funding for certain projects like that may have fallen somewhat by the wayside in the last few years, but we might get it back. If you're to look at, I guess, a center of excellence in the United States, you should look no farther, I should say, than Sheila's family. Sheila is married to Jay Jasanoff, who is a professor at Harvard, I believe, or was, of Indo-European linguistics. Her daughter, Maya, is an historian at Harvard, working at Harvard. And her son, Alan, although he teaches mainly at MIT, I believe, in biological engineering, also has a tutorship or works in some ways at Harvard to teach biological studies there as well. So at the risk of talking in baseball terms, because there is a baseball game going on right now in Toronto that some people are somewhat interested in, the Jasanoff family really sort of hits for the cycle. There's 4 of them, and they're unbeatable. And I would say the leader of the family in some ways is Sheila, who is here tonight to talk about the topic that we're talking about all these 3 days, knowledge and democracy. Sheila Jasanoff.
So good evening. Thank you all for coming. Are you wanting me to do? Conventional at this point to say I have become a Mac person, so forgive the slight problems of coordination. So I'd like to begin by thanking Bob for organizing this over many months and many exchanges back and forth. I shouldn't thank you for making it such a hard act for me to take up after Harry Collins and above all Paul Kennedy. I can't compete with chimpanzee language, and of course stories about the Perimeter Institute are also hard to beat, let alone that baseball game that's occupying everybody's mind, and you're all off somewhere with the Blue Jays in Toronto. I assume that's who are playing. But let me try my best. So knowledge and democracy. By the way, the Scottish Enlightenment part you didn't mention, though maybe you know that my daughter's last book was actually as much about Canada as it was about the United States. It's called Liberty's Exiles, and there's a whole chapter about the migration between places like New York and places like this one, and Scotland, with the families that stayed loyal to the British Crown and migrated all over the world. So I feel that through the filial connections, I actually have a tie to this part of Canada that I've never visited here before. So what I want to suggest, though, is that I'm going to enter not from the end that you heard from Harry Collins or the end that Paul Kennedy was talking about, that is from the knowledge side of things. I want to enter the discussion from the democracy side of things. And indeed, in all of the publicity that I've seen for this particular fall symposium, the democracy theme has been stressed at least as much as the knowledge theme. I am under the impression, I believe a correct one, that at least some people in this audience feel that Canada is undergoing something of a crisis at the moment, right at the nexus of knowledge and democracy, and that it therefore behooves us to think a little further about what democracy means today in a world that is saturated with knowledge. And that is the flip side of how do we do science and communicate science and behave scientifically in a world that is also democratic. So I think that that part about knowledge circulating through democracy is what you've already heard about. And if you will, I want to talk more about democracy circulating through knowledge. So democracy has a much older history than science does. In fact, this is the 800th anniversary year of Magna Carta. And although this other document is not nearly so old, the formulation, the first 3 words of that document are etched into our collective consciousness. Everybody immediately understands what we the people mean. There was even a Star Trek episode in which Captain Kirk found himself on some distant planet, and there were rituals going on and some garbled words which they eventually figured out were we the people. So there is a kind of hallowed status to the position of the collective that is called the people in a democracy, and yet those democracies have changed rather enormously in the 800 years since Magna Carta. And what do we think about all of that? One thing we think is that our constitutional documents give us a set of rights and freedoms that apply to both the knowledge and the democracy side of our collective existence. So in Canada, in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, you talk about fundamental freedoms, and among them, there is no, I believe, no mention of academic freedom as such in either your constitutional document or documents or ours, but nevertheless, there are a set of ideas that relate to the freedom of scientific inquiry. So in the Canadian Charter, everyone has the following fundamental freedoms, includes freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and freedom of association. And the parallel text in the United States is in the First Amendment. We don't declare the freedoms as an absolute rights document by itself. Rather, we declare it in the context of what a federal government is allowed to do or is not allowed to do. And this is one of the most definite prohibitions that the US Constitution provides. Congress shall make no law. And it's interesting that both the right and the left of our political spectrum are very firmly committed to the First Amendment. It has a kind of hallowed status in American constitutional jurisprudence, and it is the one thing on which a Justice Scalia can be expected to come forward and be every bit as firm in the defense of whatever he takes to be constitutional freedoms of expression as a Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, for instance. So among the things that Congress shall not abridge are, of course, freedom of speech, and that has been widely construed to include freedom to do scientific research and to express oneself in the doing of scientific research. So freedom of inquiry, though not mentioned in those words, is taken to be one of our fundamental freedoms as well. And this is mythologized in all kinds of ways, and we feel various kinds of shivers of collective unease or distress when we see abridgments, one way or another, of things that we associate with that set of ideas about expression, inquiry, research, knowledge. So possibly the best known, somewhat mythical assault on knowledge is the famous burning of the library at Alexandria, there shown in a fictionalized depiction, of course, in the 4th century, and yet it has gone down as something that humanity as a whole should worry about. And today, when a government, for instance, at whatever level, chooses to shut off funds for libraries and resources of that sort, I think there's a quite widespread sense of unease that a repository is being destroyed or undermined. It's the same kind of sort of revulsion that ISIS, for instance, has tried to awaken by destroying the cultural heritage at Palmyra. It is something that people react against. I mean, in that case, of course, the destroyers of the temples and the statuary and so forth are playing on that as a political ploy, but we see it happening in much more invisible ways, and we've seen it, certainly as I stand in this country, we've seen it on both sides of the border, that political forces have recognized that one way to undermine the foundations of living together is to undermine the kinds of resources with which we think together, inquire together, remember our heritage together, memorialize our knowledge together, and so forth. So there is an agreement that democracy needs that kind of collective memory, that kind of collective instantiation, that we need to trace our ideas back to their roots and forward again. And we agree, I think, across a very wide swath of the political spectrum that these are sort of essential elements of having a strong democracy. Nevertheless, there are disagreements, and one has to start probing a little deeper to understand where those disagreements come from. So arguably President Obama's most famous words, at least to people who are interested in the topic of knowledge and democracy as we are, were uttered in the very earliest days of his first term. So in his inaugural address in 2009, one of the things he said was, "We will restore science to its rightful place." Obama was at that point still known for soaring rhetoric, and the rhetoric soars beyond that. Wield technology's wonders to raise healthcare's quality, etc., but we will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories. You know, all this we can do, all this we will do. Well, all this we probably have not done, but nevertheless, the science being restored to its rightful place is one of the things that people believe that he has accomplished to some degree. The only problem is that we don't know what science's rightful place is, even though we celebrate the words. So there are questions for democracy that arise out of that kind of language of restoring science to its rightful place, and the kinds of questions that I want to put before us, and I make no pretense that I'll be giving complete answers to any of these things. These are more questions to think with as we think towards the future. So how does one accomplish government by the people in a world of experts and specialized knowledge? I believe that this is what Professor Collins's lecture yesterday talked about in part. But if you approach that same set of ideas from the standpoint of democracy, we are at least as much interested in how to articulate ideas of the public good when we know that the science on which we base our ideas of the collective good is itself a social production. It comes out of somewhere. People fund it. There are particular people who do it. There are particular people who don't do it. Not everybody has the luxury of bringing together the finest minds, talking about the 1/17th of a nanosecond, you know, a few seconds from the Big Bang, that quite possibly constitute one of those bits of knowledge that will not have repercussions anytime that any of us will be around to see it, although this is dangerous to predict, as always. But nevertheless, most knowledge that is produced today is relevant to the public good one way or another, and one can ask how that public good is made against a backdrop where we know that knowledge making itself is a fallible and a social enterprise. Doubt can be legitimate or not legitimate. How do we decide when it is one or the other, and how do we resolve it when the doubt is legitimate? Another way to put it is, how do we build consensus if multiple interpretations of the facts are indeed available and possible? And most broadly, we can ask how good science, science that has its own inbuilt virtues, can be reconciled with good citizenship, which also has its inbuilt virtues. Do those virtues hang together or not? If we're in the habit of saying science is in one box, politics is in a different box, then it's quite possible that goodness in those two boxes will not match, and that would be rather sad for modern democracy as well as for modern knowledge. So where do we go? Well, you talked about Scotland, but there are other famous places that one can go. One of them was this gentleman who we are told was a distinguished timekeeper, or at least the citizens of his town kept time by him, but he was also one of history's most distinguished philosophers, Immanuel Kant. And he wrote an essay, a very brief essay, on enlightenment, which is interesting in part because he was talking about what subsequently would become known as a historical period, except he was living it right then. And he was talking about what it meant to him right then as an observer of a scientific society or civilization coming into being. And one of the very well-known things he said in that essay is that enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity, and immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. So this is an ancient text, but it's as old as our constitutional documents, and it's worth keeping in mind that historically it belongs to that same period. So subsequent thinkers have talked about what Kant's idea of immaturity meant, and the very distinguished French philosopher, political theorist Michel Foucault talked about what the essence of the Kantian logic in that Enlightenment essay was. And he talked about 3 examples that Kant gives, which I think are very relevant to our discussion today. So immaturity, we're in the state of immaturity when a book takes the place of our understanding, when a spiritual director takes the place of our conscience, and when a doctor decides for us what our diet is to be. Well, so maybe it's not a book, maybe it's Google, but Google, especially as described by you, is certainly taking the place of our understanding if Google is telling us what things are reliable and what things are not, and we don't even have any idea of the software with which Google makes the choices to filter out what they choose to be feeding us, just as, by the way, we didn't know when Google was simply feeding us based on our own individual preferences, right? I mean, so if you Googled something and I Googled something, the order in which things would come up would have differed, and none of us would have known exactly how Google did that choosing. So clearly somebody is taking the place of our understanding, and it may be somebody with intentions and organizational structure, preferences, advertisers that they want to sell to, and they want to create mini populations and know that they can direct the advertisers to those mini populations. There's a whole back structure going on behind there. Well, spiritual directors taking the place of our conscience, I don't want to say very much about that, but some of you may have noticed that I come from a country in which religion is actually quite frequently a political topic, and let's just leave it at that. And when a doctor decides for us what our diet is to be, well, let's dwell on that for a minute, because food is one of the most expertise-ridden domains that we might hope to encounter in modern life today. It's becoming increasingly political, partly, I think, out of a fear of scarcity that people have in the back of their minds because of climate change and because of changing patterns of rain and drought. But much closer to home, in the food that we buy in the supermarket, there are dozens of ways in which we are relying on experts, some of them medical professionals, some of them other kinds of things, who are telling us what is good for us and what is recommended for us. So how do we know how many calories we ought to be eating or drinking? I guess Tim Horton is your equivalent of Starbucks, but in Starbucks, they didn't used to have calories for every item, and now they have calories for every item. I mean, so there's a place where, by the way, I don't think there's much interactional expertise possible because you have no idea what they measured or how they measured it to get those caloric things. Nevertheless, probably all of you have had the experience of looking at a menu in which things have caloric counts next to them and choosing the lower rather than the higher, or perhaps the other way around. And yet that is a domain of expertise which is pretty much opaque to us. We rely on somebody else to be telling us numbers that we then buy into. Reference daily intakes, same sort of thing. Cholesterol, one of the most contested sorts of topics periodically in the newspapers, not just about cholesterol itself, but about is it good or bad, and about the drugs with which you control them and their efficacy. So all these things are layered one on top of another. It's not just one thing, it's a set of different expertises that we encounter in different ways as we make choices about very simple matters like what to eat or drink on a daily basis. Genetically modified foods, I'll come back to that later, an extremely contested issue throughout the world at the moment. Genetically modified animals, so maybe the cod fisheries have collapsed, but can we substitute by breeding salmon that will be the size of elephants? I mean, you know, these are things that are part of that imagination, Paul, that you talked about, and certainly scientists are reimagining the world for us as we live and breathe, and obesity with the word epidemic often attached to it, which is entirely based on epidemiological evidence and is something that is taking over the world, it's globalizing, it's in China, it's in Britain, it's not just in the United States. The former mayor of New York City made an attempt to have contested policy about soft drinks developed on the back of guidance from the medical profession about obesity. So in the sense that Kant was talking about people making their own decisions, we are not in that world. We're constantly in a world in which we're having to place reliance on often non-transparent, opaque systems of expertise production that we meet as numbers on a bottle, on a food cafeteria line or wherever, and we have to respond to that. So in that sense, we are all immature. Does it matter, though? If experts are good and we have controls on them, do we need enlightenment in the Kantian sense at all? Why not just leave it to experts with a few checks? But what checks should those be? And what kind of maturity do we need? So do we need perhaps more mature democracies in order to make sure that we have the right experts? Or do we need to interact with those experts and have better expertise? It is at least a question that is up for grabs. So let's go back to something that people often say is the nub of the problem as we think about it, which is that we wouldn't be worried so much if we only trusted science a bit more. Because if we trusted science, then the frictions between science and democracy wouldn't arise. We wouldn't feel immature because we had good science and we would be able to trust in it. So why did we trust science in the first place? And there are a number of reasons that people have put forward. One is that science gave us a true account of nature. A second is that science has its own inbuilt forms of skepticism. So we in the outside world who are not part of the scientific communities that we're talking about don't need to be skeptical because science does its own skepticism and does it well enough, thank you. A third was that science was humble, that science did not believe that any of its claims were anything other than conjectures and provisional, and that science was therefore continually self-correcting and took a modest posture vis-a-vis the world. Another was that science was experimental, which meant that science got back signals from the world, saying whether things were going well or going badly according to whatever hypothesis was being tested, and the bad experiments got left behind, and therefore the experimentalism was a self-corrective in and of itself. And last but not least, science was seen as a model of civic engagement because science is collaborative in many ways. Science depends on people replicating each other's results, building on them. This is not any longer an ivory tower kind of enterprise. Well, let's go through each of these one at a time and see that we are not in as innocent a world as this set of reasons for trusting science might lead us to believe we're in. So, truth to nature. Well, science often gets it wrong, so why? And one sees getting it wrong on many levels. There are mistakes, some of them very dramatic. That's the BP oil spill. Now, of course, one might be tempted to say, well, that's technology, and in fact, many people say that's technology, but in fact, there's not a very easy way to draw a line between where the science ends and the technology begins, and very often the safety judgments are based on scientific understandings of what is at stake and what could go wrong. I could today just as easily have shown a picture of Fukushima. I mean, there are dramatic accidents and dramatic failures all the time. And the hype questions are there too. And in fact, even inside of the scientific enterprise, people call attention to the hype. So today, for instance, the synthetic biology community regularly chides the molecular biology community for having engaged in hype. And they say things, and I've heard them say it, so it's not a hypothetical, that molecular biology promised 40 years ago that they would cure cancer and make life much better. And what have they accomplished of all the things that they said they would? Now look at us, we are the real, heroes of the moment, and we will build from the ground up and deliver things. Well, we'll see whether that in itself turns out to be hype or not. So this truth to nature claim is very problematic in all kinds of ways, and I hope you heard something about that yesterday as well. Consensus. This is thought to be a strong reason for trusting in science, that people are skeptical of each other, and the flip side, therefore, when a skeptical community achieves consensus, is that the consensus must be more robust, because they already questioned each other, and therefore they have come up with a consensus. But the world doesn't actually buy into that totally, because even within the sciences, it is possible to develop herd instinct and closed minds about which things are worth looking at and which not. I remember, for instance, that one of the very first times I encountered Sherry Rowland, who subsequently got the Nobel Prize for chemistry because of his work on chlorofluorocarbons and ozone depletion. I met him at Cornell in the early years as a sort of scientific persona non grata who had been read out of the chemistry community because he had dared to say that these commercially extremely important chemicals had a problem associated with them. So it is not the case that scientists are never out in the wilderness and yet are subsequently proved to be right. It happens. And when the scientific consensus, as in what is lampooned here, is produced through a fairly small community of people interacting very regularly with one another, the chances of developing an internal code of ethics, set of conventions that systematically ignore and leave out certain dimensions of what a skeptic might want to look at, these are heightened, and we've seen many examples of that. By the way, this is a cartoon merely to illustrate what the skeptical community is saying. Obviously, it is not my personal set of views. Lack of accountability. Well, is science indeed humble? That is one reason we were supposed to believe science, because science is modest. But many people believe that science is not, in fact, held accountable to the standard institutions that we have of accountability in a democratic society. If there was supposed to be a Supreme Court of science, the benches are arguably empty because we don't know who is occupying them or where appeals ultimately go. And we can discuss this, but there is no, it is felt that the horizontal accountability among peers is sufficient to hold science to high standards of democratic accountability, and yet that has turned out not to be quite enough. What about experimentalism? Well, of course, science is experimental, and often when it's inside the lab setting, it works perfectly well. But increasingly, the important sciences and their technologies are not just experimenting inside the lab, but are quite overtly experimenting outside the lab. So for instance, if you look at a company, a biotech agricultural company, the ads look like this, and the self-justification looks like this, that we will take wilderness of growth and turn it regular and ordered and in neat and clean rows. Well, I mean, that is a vast experiment that is being conducted on nature, and one might ask, is there sufficient accountability for something that is happening on that kind of scale? So maybe there are people in this room who believe that agricultural biotechnology has sufficiently proved itself. We can have that discussion. But maybe the same people would feel a bit differently about geoengineering. Certainly the majority of scientists that I know who are involved in climate change don't feel enthusiastic about geoengineering and do not believe that that degree of intervention on a planetary scale has actually proved itself, and yet it is an experimental thing. It's something that many scientists, some of my colleagues included, believe ought to be done in a more sort of widespread way. Then what about the civic engagement point, that science itself serves as a kind of polity and does not need other checks? Thank you. So in the United States, administrative law operates a bit differently from the way it does in other countries, and we do civic engagement a bit differently. But other countries, most notably our closest neighbor across the ocean, does not do civic engagement in the same way. A lot of it is much more top-down. People are invited to participate because they're felt to be the right stakeholders. So where our administrative law says that any interested and affected person, in principle, can have a say in any regulatory matter, in Britain and through much of Europe, that decision is instead left to the central government, which decides who gets to participate or not. So civic engagement in Britain on the issue of GM crops took very different forms. And in fact, my British colleagues have called it uninvited participation. The whole idea of uninvited participation strikes a US American as a bit odd, because all our participation, in a sense, is uninvited participation. But the very fact that you have this category says something about the nature of civic engagement, and uninvited participation often took the form of destroying the things that science was doing of an experimental nature. This one involved a peer of the realm who made a practice of digging up experimental crops, but the one I like best, which was happening during the impeachment scandal in the US, was Greenpeace's stunt of dropping a truckload of genetically modified maize in front of 10 Downing Street, asking for Tony Blair to take account of the fact that American imports were not necessarily the most reliable thing to bring into Britain without a further inquiry of some sort. All right, so one can then stop and say that given that all of these sort of standard reasons for trusting science have problems associated with them, problems that I've only been able to gesture at. There are entire literatures on each of these topics that I've very quickly gone over, giving you pictures instead of text for the most part. One can ask about the flip side. How do scientists and how does scientific authority understand its publics? Because without a kind of understanding that is, I mean, we talk a lot about how the public understands science. There's even an entire field called public understanding of science. It's called PUS, which unfortunately doesn't read very nicely, but it's called PUS anyway. Some people stick a T on just to sanitize it and call it public understanding of science and technology, but there isn't an SUP, scientists' understanding of the public. And what I would like to suggest is that science, modern science, has actually built into it an idea of the subject who needs to be governed in a rational society. And that idea, I think, itself needs to be taken out from under wraps, looked at more closely, and looked at critically from the standpoint of democracy. So my colleague Brian Wynne coined a term a long time ago, the deficit model of the public, but this is actually very widespread by now, and it refers to the fact that most scientists judge the capacity of publics by their capacity to do what Paul was talking about before. That is, do they understand the science that we're talking about? And if they don't, then their role ought to be something else. It should be celebratory, it should be making art about it. It should not be to try to get into the same domain that we're in. It should not be about telling us what to do. We should make the decisions because we understand the contents better. But this idea of the public has certain assumptions built in that go beyond simple ignorance. That is, it's not just that the public doesn't understand. Today, it's a far more complicated edifice. It is that the public doesn't understand because it has systematic cognitive biases built into the brain which produce wrong-headed assessments of the probabilities of things, and these then lead to incorrect assessments of what is a relative low risk versus a relative high risk. For instance, nobody's going to die of eating GM foods, yet they will die of traffic accidents, and yet people drive, but they won't allow GM foods. That's a typical example of the kind of incorrect assessment of relative risks and benefits that scientists point to when they say that the public has this sort of systematic cognitive bias in the brain. And therefore, we need to correct for those biases through appropriate forms of expert advice. And just a couple of quotes to show you that this is not, it's widespread, it's on both sides of the Atlantic, it's not made up. So Steven Pinker, one of my erudite and very famous colleagues, had this editorial a while ago with all the same examples that you hear over and over again. A baby sucks on a pencil, panicky mother. I mean, you really think that 2007, I mean, this is healthily after the women's movement and feminism. You would think that the panicky mother might just be the panicky parent, even if one is going to say this. But anyway, there is a deficit model of the family built in there as well. I just read the other day that a French TV station was trying to highlight how many women it has among its commentators and put out an ad, this is just in last week, saying that all our commentators are now commentatrices. I mean, you know, so, but in the background they showed pictures of households falling into rack and ruin. So one picture, one image was a shirt with an iron and flames coming out of the shirt, and so people yelled that this were sexist ads, and they've been pulled. But the point is that there still is this kind of presumption here, but the deficit model isn't only about that. Politician argues that hydrogen can replace fossil fuels as our nation's energy source. I mean, you know, that's a particularly interesting one because actually many auto manufacturers are imagining the hydrogen fuel cycle and how it might come into being. So it's not that weird if a politician buys into that imagination. A consumer tells a reporter she refuses to eat tomatoes that have genes in them. This is based totally on a public understanding of science survey about biotechnology. News magazine condemns the prospects of cloning because it could mass produce an army of zombies. Well, I mean, you know, we have fictionalized that scenario for 100 years now. So again, it's not surprising that it is there in the cultural consciousness, but they're all dismissed as examples of scientific illiteracy, inane misconceptions that could have been avoided with a smidgen of freshman science. Well, Harvard actually doesn't admit anyone unless they've already had a few smidgens of so-called freshman science. That is, Harvard freshman science begins at a level higher than, quote, freshman science, unquote, and yet some of these beliefs are held by students I know. So this is not about a deficit of knowledge. That's not what is going on. This is also particularly interesting because it is based on a researcher who has since been discredited and left Harvard, but he alleged that people are born with a universal moral grammar, and that moral grammar teaches them, sometimes erroneously, what things to favor and what things to disfavor if you put it to them in the form of trolley problems, binary moral choices. Would you rather do this or that? And that brain scanners can tell you if they're thinking with the proper part of their brain in making those choices or not. And correct education can move a decision from the emotive center of the brain to the more rational sides of the brain and thereby produce a different set of results. But the point is that these things are widespread. They too get picked up and circulate, and this is from a policy text actually coming out of my school. By the way, Paul, one small corrective. It's the Kennedy School of Government, and I am by no means its founder. I'm only the founder of the fairly modest program on science, technology, and society within the Kennedy School. But in any case, this is at the Kennedy School. Research has also revealed anomalies in the way in which people use information and respond to situations. But see what's happening there from the standpoint of democracy. We the people has now become they the people, and they the people have defective brains. I mean, there's something hardwired wrong inside of their heads. I would suggest that some of this is built into the way in which we came over time to actually make decisions. The ability to reason is a relatively new arrival to which humans have not yet adapted. I mean, you know, this is a quotation from a major instructor in a major university who believes that this is what the public is. I mean, of course, the snide question that comes to mind is, how have some of us escaped it, such that we are entitled to be decision makers? You know, what is it that rescues us? But I think the deeper question is, if these are our theories about what people are like, if this is what the demos in the democracy is, then, you know, who cares who gets elected? You know, the demos is doomed anyway, because it is fundamentally irrational, incapable of being educated, incapable of being brought up to reason. We may as well have the giant computer programmed by Google that not only tells us what we should read, but also how we should decide on the basis of what we've read, and then go on from there. All right, so that could be a huge discussion. But I do think that if we cast citizens as fundamentally foolish, untutored, immature, there is at least a big puzzle. If Kant thought, at the same time that our constitutions were being written, that humans were being released from their immaturity, what has happened such that 220 years later, we have become a worldwide demos of fools? I mean, you know, how is it that we're back to immaturity when our information systems have grown and expanded and become what they are? And if that is the real state of affairs, if you will, then, you know, it is a situation to weep for, but I think that fortunately we're not that bereft. So here and towards the end, I want to turn to what is, after all, my professional center, which is studies of law. I'm a lawyer by training, and this is why I have a particular fondness for constitutional orders and the kinds of regulatory structures and models of citizenship which the law supports. And if one turns to the law, the models of citizenship there are of far greater competence than the ones that I've been showing you coming out of the sciences. So the law on the whole presumes, even with the fundamental freedoms point, there's no point guaranteeing people rights to speak and think and inquire and believe and reason unless you have a fundamental conviction that people are capable of it, for the most part. So it just doesn't sit well with fundamental freedoms that presuppose a freedom of inquiry and ability to believe things that we want to believe. If we then curtail it by saying that evolutionarily somehow we have lost the capacity to reason. And in our laws, you can find all of these other rights as well, to demand reasons, to participate, offer expertise, give informed consent. What would the medical world be like if there were no informed consent provisions? That's not a place where most of us are eager to give up on our right to understand, get knowledge, and respond. Secondly, public knowledge, what we share publicly and collectively, is embedded in a political culture which has particular rules for testing evidence and making it robust in the public domain. And we can come back to this in Q&A. I don't want to go into it in extreme detail now, but there's decades of research now showing that countries are committed to styles of public reasoning, so consensus-based or adversarial. The US tends to be more adversarial. Germany tends to be more consensus-based. I mean, how did a company like VW introduce this deceit device? You know, how could a leading company in a country that prides itself on following the law, you know, have done something like this? There is some kind of consensus world that was constructed there that allowed them to think that this was a reasonable thing to do, which was really, I mean, for a company that could go down the tubes as a result, I mean, it was a staggering misjudgment at the very least. So styles of public reasoning matter, and they go through institutional cultures in all kinds of ways. So supposing we ignore that public knowledge making is cultural, rests on law, rests on presumptions about citizenship, what happens? You get backlash of different kinds. So for instance, even very eminent scientists like Lord Martin Rees, formerly head of the Royal Society and Britain's Astronomer General and one of the most distinguished figures in British public science, was criticized for his views of scientific engagement with society. In other words, it should get more money, said Simon Jenkins. Well, admittedly, this is writing in The Guardian, which has a particular kind of editorializing discourse and style. Probably it wouldn't have been said in the US, but nevertheless, it is a problem for the scientific culture if people read a scientist's call to engage with the public as a mere call for more public funding of science. In the US, we have a typically other sort of set of reactions. And, you know, all of the respectable people in universities, by far the majority of American academic scientists and academics in general, were in despair at the way that the George W. Bush administration was treating science. And this war on science metaphor was hugely current. Books were written with that title. And it was extremely widespread. So widespread was it that scientists became political at a national political level that we have not seen regularly. So for instance, a large number of Nobel laureates came out explicitly supporting Obama in the 2008 election because they felt it was necessary to ally themselves with the national political scene. And at that time, many scientists, including many of my friends, felt that there was really no choice, that they actually had to put themselves on the hustings and become political in an overt way, I mean, in a party political way. So what happens? If you get politicized, then, you know, other forms of politics intervene, and everybody starts looking at everybody with a degree of skepticism. This is a very recent story about a faculty colleague of mine who wrote an article in which there was no disclosure of the fact that the funding came from, well, it says the seed giant Monsanto. This is all public records. I'm not showing you anything secret. And this circulates, so it's not just in one place. Newspapers pick it up and it goes from one place to another. And the skepticism is not any longer restricted to the right, saying that climate change is a ploy and a plot of the liberal left. The left is equally capable of saying that scientific knowledge is being bought and is being manufactured. So another very recent episode in which the liberal Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren took a very distinguished economist to task for not having disclosed, she said, in public testimony, what the sources of funds were for a report that he wrote that was contrary to the spirit of some legislation that she was favoring. And the Brookings Institution, which is a very respected think tank, severed its connections with this economist who is, you know, had been affiliated with the Brookings Institution for decades, and then he lashed out against Elizabeth Warren in public, so that, again, the sort of one of the fundamental sciences that is underwriting public policy, namely economics, has been drawn into this public debate. And it's not, as I say, the right attacking left science. This is a case of the left, if you will, attacking, you know, mainstream science or what have you. So be careful, one might say, about how one aligns oneself in this set of political debates, as the scientific community has done. Well, so what, if any, answers are there? And one can return to, some very basic points. And I returned to this partly because Barb told me that this has been a collaborative activity between various units on campus, including music, and that you had a wonderful concert last night. And I was reminded of a very famous sociologist of knowledge. I believe I may actually have heard of him for the first time from none other than Harry Collins and his work as well. But in any case, he was talking about how the blood serum test for syphilis developed, and Fleck had an extremely nuanced way of understanding how scientific consensus emerges, and the analogy he chose was music. So that people hear a tune, somebody hears the tune more clearly than other people, and then the co-workers and collaborators start tuning, metaphorically, their sets to be in tune, and then eventually everybody hears the same tune. So let me stop by saying that for the future of scientific citizenship, we might ask for a society that necessarily is tuned to the future of science and technology. There's no way that we can do without, but in their rightful places, understood in a certain way, so subordinated to the mandates of the We the People document, subordinated to the public's right to doubt, the right to ask for explanations, the right to evaluate biases and interests in the production of knowledge, the right to hold people accountable for their errors, the right to imagine futures both with and without certain kinds of science and technology, and the right to decide how and when to exercise those rights. These are rights that I think we cannot give up. So let's hope then for a co-working science and society along the lines of the attuned model that Ludwig Fleck proposed, though he was talking about the insides of science, and we're now talking about a much broader collaboration between a mature DMAS and a mature scientific enterprise. So with that, let me stop. Thank you.